Hello students, this is Professor McDermott with the video recap of your Module 4 discussions. I'm going to have to talk fast this time, I think, because we had more questions than usual, as I'm sure you noticed. Alright, well, talking about the Age of Enlightenment and some of the great philosophers of the Enlightenment, which you did a very good job of reading. Group 1 had the great English philosopher John Locke. And in his second treatise of government, Locke talks a lot about the family, actually. So I asked Group 1, why did they think Locke's insights about the family were so important to him, and how did they relate to his ideas about government? Brandy Bowman, you had an excellent post on this. According to Locke, it is a parent's responsibility to care for their child while they are young, to guide them and give them knowledge, but eventually, as the child grows up, they become more independent and free-thinking. But the child is their own person and eventually should be making their own decisions. This compares directly to his beliefs about the government, in which he believes that the government has the responsibility to protect their people in times of weakness, but ultimately, it is the people who make the decisions on what they want their government to be like. And I think that's absolutely right. Locke said that once you come of age, you have free will, and you should be free to make your own choices in society, and you should have a say in the government. You're not a child anymore. Our founding fathers were very interested in John Locke and drew on a lot of his ideas, and often they would make arguments like that. They would say, you know, we were children when we were colonies, but now we've grown up and we want to be free and independent. So you see the influence of Locke there. Question 2, I asked for Locke, what is the necessary condition of government? What is required to have a legitimate government? And Lavandria Jones, I liked your post on this. The necessary condition for people to form a community is for every man to consent on joining together. Government is formed and run based off of a majority. To be a successful community, you have to move as one body. This means the greater force carries the consent to be conducted. Yes, so Locke absolutely believes that unless a government is run based on the consent of its citizens, it's not a legitimate government. It's a tyranny. And furthermore, he believes in the concept of majority rule. So once the people consent and agree to form a community, they also agree to be bound by the wishes of the majority. Finally, I asked, does Locke think that the three natural rights, which he lists as life, liberty, and property, carry over into the state of society? Natural rights were rights that were believed to belong to all human beings in the state of nature before government. But I asked, did Locke believe that they also apply when there is a government? And Lakeisha Grimsley, you had a good answer to this. This was the group answer posted by Chair Lakeisha Grimsley. Nice job, Lakeisha. As a group, we agree that in order to have order and be safe, that rules must be in place. We agree that rules help guide people in the society to safety on the right track. This makes sure that we are not jeopardizing our natural rights as citizens. So yes, absolutely. Locke believes that we still keep our natural right to life, liberty, and property, even after we agree to form a government. And that sets him apart from some other thinkers like Rousseau that we'll talk about in a minute. But in the English and American tradition, there's always been this idea that government exists to protect our natural rights, which can never be taken away. That's the whole purpose of our government. But on to Rousseau, who has some very different ideas. Rousseau, of course, was Swiss. He wrote in French, and he's coming out of a different tradition of Enlightenment thought. And in his great book, The Social Contract, Rousseau talks about how societies come out of the state of nature and form a contract of society. And what is necessary for that, I asked in question 1. And Haley Rainey, you had a good post here. What's necessary is that individual people would give up the total alienation of each associate, together with all his rights, to the whole community. For in the first place, as each gives himself absolutely, the conditions are the same for all. Now, you see, this is very different from Locke, because for Rousseau, when you agree to form part of a society, you have to sacrifice all your rights, absolutely, to that society as part of, in exchange for the privilege of protection from this society that you formed. And obviously, this is a very different approach. It's much more communitarian and collective rather than focused on individual rights like Locke had been. And furthermore, Rousseau calls the ruler or the sovereign in his society the general will, and by that he means the general will of all the people acting together makes decisions, and that way no one is left out, so no one has anything to complain about. But I asked group two, did they think this concept of the general will really would work if it were put into practice? And Catherine McDonald, you got an excellent post here. I would like to think that the general will solution could work, but I am a little skeptical. The will of the people is supposed to have absolute power, yet it is necessary for the government to regulate and enforce it. My fear is that the will of the people might get a little lost in translation through the government officials, and the system won't work as well as Rousseau may have imagined. And that's actually a problem many political scientists have pointed out with Rousseau's thought. You have to have a government, and how accurately is that going to reflect the general will of the people? Furthermore, Rousseau says that the goal of this is perfect freedom in society, but there are always going to be people who are not going to agree with the general will, who are going to go against the grain or against the government, and what should be done with those people? And Rousseau says simply, people like that should be forced to be free, forced to be free. And I asked group three if they really thought anybody could ever be forced to be free. And here's the group answer posted by Aaron Ravago, and you also did a very nice job as chair, Aaron. Our conclusion would be that no one particular person would want to be forced into doing anything they don't want to do, even if that is freedom. I would think that freedom would already be understood and not needed to be brought to someone's attention. So, yeah, I think because we're in this Anglo-American tradition coming from Locke, this idea that someone could be forced to be free without their consent is somewhat alien to us. But it was a very important idea in the French Enlightenment. And as we'll see, something that came into play during the French Revolution, making the French Revolution a very different kind of revolution from the American Revolution. All right. Moving on to group three, the philosopher Immanuel Kant from Prussia in what's now Germany, and his very, very famous essay, What is Enlightenment? Well, what is enlightenment? Chance Stodhill put it this way. Kant defined enlightenment as, quote, man's emergence from his self-imposed nonage, end quote. Nonage meaning a state of childhood. According to this definition, Kant is expressing his belief that man cannot be enlightened until he has become independent and matured to think on his own or use his own intelligence. The process is difficult for man to progress in because they have become too comfortable, depending on other people's understandings rather than making an effort on their own. Kant quotes that man must dare to know, meaning that one has to make an effort in wanting change. According to Kant, the obstacles in the way of enlightenment are laziness and cowardice. These two obstacles are what makes the process difficult. So for Kant, we're called to be adults, as Locke said. We're called to be free and use our own minds, dare to know, and not just follow what other people are telling us to do. That is the key to enlightenment. And the condition that's really necessary to make enlightenment happen, Kant says, and the whole group agreed on, was freedom. But Kant believed that freedom had to have its limits. Too much freedom could be very dangerous for society. Why was that? Well, here's the group answer posted by Dave Sparks. Excellent job as chair, Dave. Unfettered freedom can lead to the complete failure of society. History has shown us that too much freedom enables people to dispute and argue everything that is not in their line of thinking. You end up with many people with various points of view on a particular subject and no one coming to a consensus on the most beneficial course of action. Sounds familiar. The flow of free and open discussion becomes uncontrolled and disrespectful. Unrestricted social freedom can also lead to malicious acts of public nuisance and law breaking. Furthermore, it should be restricted to give a people more time for goal setting, thought, education, and achievement, thus leading to enlightenment. And I think that those are all excellent points. I really like the last point especially, because Kant would have had in mind the French Revolution. And the French Revolution, in a sense, provided so much freedom so fast that people couldn't process it. And it really ultimately led to chaos and a lot of crime and destruction. And when a society is in turmoil and fighting amongst themselves, there is no time for education. There's no time for reflection or philosophy or anything else that Kant values. And so he wants freedom, and enlightenment, but he wants the freedom to be a kind of ordered freedom, all right? Liberty, not license to do anything you want. All right, very good. Now let's go on to the Age of Revolution documents. And Group 1, you had the Declaration of the Rights of Man and the Citizen from the French Revolution. And I'm going to have to rush through this a little bit because I don't want to make this too long. But you all agreed that in the document, human rights, natural rights are protected, but only to the extent that that you do not violate the law. As Lavandria pointed out, liberty consists in being able to do everything which injures no one else. And in the group answer posted by Lakeisha here, limitations are set in place by law to our natural rights. Okay, now that is an unusual situation compared to our Constitution, where our rights, in a sense, are protected in almost all circumstances. In revolutionary France, if the National Assembly or the Convention made a law taking away your rights, then your rights were gone. And that was a catch, in a sense, in this document, Declaration of the Rights of Man. Jaquisha Gilbert, you had an interesting post on this. In all the sections, they have rights, but the rights are limited within the law. In order for them to have their rights taken away, they have to violate the law. I do see a potential problem that might result in people having their rights violated because they might think the law is contradictory, because they're basically saying you have freedom to do, say, or feel how you want, but you have to do it our way. Again, that's that Rousseauian idea. You have to be forced to be free, forced to think like we do. And so you see how out of enlightenment, in many ways, the French Revolution became something of a tyranny over the mind rather than a process of enlightenment. All right, moving on to Group 2, you had the Marquis de Condorcet. And Condorcet represents the great hopes that the revolution sparked in these Enlightenment thinkers. They really thought that it was going to lead to great things. And what was Condorcet hoping for from the revolution? Brianna Mack, you put it well. He wanted abolition of inequality between nations, progress of equality within each nation, and true perfection of mankind. Yes, he believed that mankind could become absolutely perfect. And Brianna, you went on to say, I disagree, because every nation is different. It would be hard to come to an agreement on things, especially if one nation feels strongly one way about one situation and another nation feels strongly another way about the situation. And so I think you guys were all properly skeptical about some of Condorcet's hopes for human perfection. In the group answer to question 2, posted by Aaron, we have come to the conclusion that inequality will really never disappear. Due to how people are with different mindsets and how they treat other people, it couldn't really disappear. But the only thing we can change is ourselves to better ourselves. And I think we see here how noble the ideals of the French Revolution were. Liberty, equality, fraternity, and so forth. And it really looked great on paper, but human nature is a little messy, and trying to put that into practice can and did lead to problems. All right, and Group 3's documents show that they had 2 laws passed by the National Convention. The first law basically mobilized the entire population of France, including old men, women, and children, to support the war effort. of the French Revolutionary Wars. And I asked the group if they thought that nations should have power to ask their citizens to make those kinds of sacrifices. Shakitra was really nervous about that. She said nations, in my opinion, should not have unlimited power to make people sacrifice in times of national emergency. And then group three, I like the way you really wrestled with this question. And ultimately, I think the group came to a consensus that yes, sometimes nations need to force their citizens to do things like this in a national emergency. But you were a little more skeptical about the second law, which basically gave the authorities permission to round up anyone who was suspected of being a spy or a traitor and lock them up and punish them without proper evidence and without a fair trial. And here's what you said about that, group three. We can see where passing the law of suspects was what the leaders of the time thought was needed to rout all enemies of the revolution out of hiding. But all of the subsequent provisions affected the people's civil rights as well. Provision 1 stated that all the suspect persons who are in the territory of the Republic and who are still at liberty shall be placed under arrest. These provisions were extremely dangerous to people's rights. Without question or full evident reason, an innocent person could be subject to arrest against their will just for being suspected. None of us would like to live in a society with any law of this sort, because it violates freedom. And as Americans, we do cherish our liberties, but it's interesting to see that the French tradition and other societies have defined those liberties quite differently than we have. All right, I better stop here. You've been very patient. Excellent job, everyone. Looking forward to the next round. Thanks.